Beneath the shining cities and the sunlit fields, in the glittering waters of the narrow sea, something was suffering. Something ancient and alien and patient beyond human comprehension had been enduring a slow, poisonous torment for centuries, and its patience was finally coming to an end. The Farim were not creatures that belonged to the world as most beings understood it. They were not born of the natural order. They did not eat, drink, sleep, or reproduce in any way that surface dwellers would recognize. They were cone-shaped horrors, elongated, floating bodies that tapered to a point at the base, with a ring of tentacles at the top and a single fanged maw that could bite through stone. They had no eyes, yet they perceived the world around them with a precision that surpassed sight. They had no vocal cords, yet they communicated through telepathy of such power that it could overwhelm an unprotected mind like a wave crashing over a sandcastle. And they were, without any exaggeration whatsoever, among the most magically powerful creatures on the face of Teril. The Farim cast spells without components, no gestures, no incantations, no material focuses, no spellbooks. They simply willed magic into existence, drawing upon the weave with a fluency that was instinctive rather than learned. A single Farim could match the output of a skilled human arcanist. An elder Farim could challenge a high arcanist of the enclaves, and they were not solitary creatures. They existed in communities, coordinating their magical efforts with a collective intelligence that multiplied their individual power many times over. They had lived beneath the surface of Faerun since before the rise of Netheril, since before the founding of the Elven kingdoms, since an age so remote that the very concept of recorded history had not yet been invented. They inhabited the deep places of the earth, vast caverns and tunnels in the Underdark, far below the reach of sunlight, where they fed upon the ambient magical energy of the weave that permeated the stone and soil above them. It was a quiet existence by their standards. They had their own concerns, their own rivalries, their own alien culture that bore no resemblance to anything on the surface. They were aware of the surface dwellers in a general sense, but they regarded them with the same detached indifference that a whale might regard the barnacles on its belly. Irrelevant, beneath notice, until the magic began to seep down. The Netherese, in their relentless pursuit of magical advancement, had never considered what happened to the magical energy they consumed. When an arcanist drew upon the weave to cast a spell, the energy was transformed, used, and dissipated. When a Mythaller drew upon the weave to power an entire flying city's worth of quasi-magical items, the energy was consumed on a vastly larger scale. And the byproducts of this consumption, the magical residue, the waste energy, the distorted weave threads left behind by billions of individual magical operations, had to go somewhere. It seeped downward, through the soil, through the rock, into the deep places of the earth where the Farim lived. For the Farim, it was as though the sky above them had begun to rain poison. The magical residue from Netheril's surface activities disrupted the natural flow of weave energy in the Underdark. It contaminated the ambient magic that the Farim depended on for sustenance. It created zones of wild magic where spells behaved unpredictably, and dead magic zones where the weave was so badly damaged that no spell could function at all. The Farim's underground homes, which had been stable and comfortable for eons, became increasingly uninhabitable. Their food source, the ambient magic of the weave, was being poisoned, diluted, and disrupted by the ceaseless magical activity of the civilization above. For centuries the Farim endured. They were patient creatures, and they understood that surface civilizations were temporary things. They rose, they flourished, they fell, and the earth endured. But Netheril did not fall. It grew. Every year brought new flying cities, new Mythallers, new waves of magical consumption. Every year the contamination worsened. Every year the Farim's domain shrank a little further, their feeding grounds a little more degraded, their suffering a little more intense. And then an event occurred that transformed the Farim's passive suffering into active, calculated war. A surface elf named Olosten, the histories are unclear on his background, his motivations, and his ultimate fate, somehow made contact with the Farim. Perhaps he was an explorer who ventured too deep. Perhaps he was a refugee who fled underground. Perhaps he was simply mad. What matters is that Olaston, for reasons that may have included personal grievance against the Netherese, provided the Farim with detailed intelligence about the surface world. He told them about the enclaves, about the Mythalars, about the vulnerabilities of Netherese society. He gave them, in short, everything they needed to wage an effective war against the empire above. In gratitude, or perhaps in cold, calculated exchange, the Farim gave Olastin a powerful magical item and directed him to a fortress where he would be safe from Netherese retribution. Olastin subsequently became a notorious figure, earning a reputation as a ruthless killer of Netherese, who by the end of his life had slain over 28,000 beings. A powerful arcanist eventually killed him, but the damage was done. The information Olastin had given the Farim had provided them with the strategic knowledge they needed to strike back. In negative 461 of the Dollar Reckoning, the Farim launched their counterattack. They did not charge to the surface with armies. They did not lay siege to cities. The Farim were far too intelligent for such crude tactics. Instead, they developed spells, terrible, patient, insidious spells, that drained both life energy and magical energy from the surface of Netheril. These spells worked slowly, over years and decades, but their effects were devastating. Where they took hold, the land above withered and died. Forests became skeletal wastelands. Rivers dried to dusty channels. Fertile farmland turned to sand. The very soil lost its capacity to support life, becoming barren and sterile as the moisture and vitality were sucked downward into the earth. These wastelands, the barrens as the Netherese came to call them, began appearing throughout the territory of Low Netheril. At first they were small and isolated, easily dismissed as natural phenomena. But they grew, they spread, they merged. And as they expanded, the arcanists of the enclaves began to realize that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. The Farim's magic also interfered with the Mythalars themselves. The quasi-magical items that made life on the enclaves so comfortable began to malfunction. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but in small, irritating, increasingly frequent ways. Lights flickered, temperatures fluctuated, enchanted tools worked intermittently. The Mythalars still kept the enclaves aloft. The fundamental levitation magic was too deeply embedded to be easily disrupted. But the quality of life on the flying cities began to degrade. The arcanists moved their enclaves, repositioning them over unaffected territory. But the damage followed them. Wherever the flying cities went, the barons appeared below, as though the Farim were targeting the Mythalars specifically, draining the magical energy that the enclaves consumed and leaving desolation in their wake. The Netherese were, for the first time in their history, on the defensive. They fought back, of course. Netherese war magic was devastating, and the arcanists launched expedition after expedition into the Underdark to find and destroy the Farim. But the Farim were fighting on their own territory, in tunnels and caverns that they had inhabited for ages, and they were individually as powerful as all but the most accomplished Netherese arcanists. The underground campaigns were bloody, costly, and ultimately inconclusive. The Netherese could not eliminate the Farim. The Farim could not destroy Netheril from below. The war settled into a grinding, attritional stalemate. But it was a stalemate that favored the Farim, because their spells continued to drain the surface, while the Netherese could find no way to stop them. The barrens spread. The narrow sea, that great body of water that had sustained the earliest Netherese settlements, began to shrink as the land around it dried and died. Farmlands that had fed generations were swallowed by expanding deserts. The common people of Low Netheril, the farmers, the fishermen, the laborers who had always lived in the shadow of the enclaves, began to flee, abandoning their homes and seeking refuge in regions beyond the reach of the Farim's draining magic. The population of Low Netheril plummeted. The social fabric of the empire, already strained by the division between high and low, began to tear. Eventually, another power intervened. The Sharn, mysterious, benevolent creatures whose nature is poorly understood even by the greatest sages, defeated the Farim in a conflict that the histories record only in the vaguest terms. The Sharn imprisoned the Farim beneath the surface of Anauroch, constructing a magical barrier that came to be known as the Sharn Wall. Behind this barrier, the Farum were contained, their draining magic blocked, their threat neutralized. But the damage was done. The barrens that the Farum had created would never fully heal. Over the centuries that followed, they would expand and merge and deepen, eventually becoming the great desert of Anauroch, a vast, lifeless wasteland that swallowed the heartland of the old Netherese territory and erased every trace of the fertile paradise that had once existed there. The narrow sea dried up completely, leaving nothing but sand and stone where ships had once sailed and children had once swum. The war with the Farum had not destroyed Netheril, but it had wounded the empire grievously, draining its resources, scattering its common population, and, perhaps most importantly, creating a sense of desperation among the arcanists of the enclaves. The empire was in trouble. The old certainties were crumbling. The magic that had always solved every problem was now, for the first time, part of the problem itself. It was into this atmosphere of fear and desperation that a child was born, a child of such extraordinary magical talent that he would be hailed as the savior of Netheril, a child whose ambition would exceed even the vast, towering arrogance of the great arcanists who had come before him. The child's name was Karsus, and the elves, who had watched the Netherese with unease for millennia, had a name for him too. They called him the child who would become a god,